History shapes everything we do and everything we believe. Across the centuries, a few have written the stories of humanity, and in doing so, have silenced countless others. Choke Points Through Time is where those voices are heard again. Discover the truths history tried to hide and the forces that still shape our world today. Choke Points Through Time, a journey through the pivotal moments of mankind's story. This is history as you've never heard it before. And now, here is Dr. Wayne Sedlak.
John Adams, the second president of the United States, but long before any of that occurred, long before we had won our independence, was caught up in the middle of an intense debate in the Congress of 1775. You recall that was the era when we had entered the War of Independence. But there's a debate in the Congress about the use of privateers. A privateer is one who is commissioned, in this case, by the Congress to prey upon enemy shipping. Of course, the enemy is going to call them pirates, the slander notwithstanding. The debate among Christian men, the very fact of the debate, shows you there was a Christian background. There was a Christian testimony in operation in the hearts of these men. This was piracy. It would entail ships being sunk, cargoes being seized. Is that not theft? But of course, we're at war. That's the other side. John Adams stood up to speak. He said, "It is prudent not to put virtue to too serious a test. I would use American virtue as sparingly as possible, lest we wear it out." Now, that came as a shock to a lot of people, but most of the delegates understood it. He was not saying that virtue was not to be used. He was citing biblical passages that show that there comes a point where the virtue of Christian people is not sufficient maturity for the evils they face. Satan is ever growing in deceit. There's a limit to what he can do. Wicked men shall wax worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived. That's been going on for a long time. Why? Because the Holy Spirit keeps pushing his church to mature. We're in such an age. A lot of people that either want to be Christians or grew up Christian and maybe haven't been practicing, or actually are Christian people, professing Christian people, are stunned as to what, surprised. They don't know. They're confused as to what to do with the massive amount of evil confronting our nation, confronting the world. What did John Adams mean? And what did the delegates to that Continental Congress finally understand him to undertake? What did he mean, and what was undertaken as a result? Because the idea passed. In fact, it passed well when they got the message. Virtue, if it's immature, can't handle certain aspects of maturity and withdraws upon itself and tends to vote no and even condemn that which is beyond its grasp. In fact, it can be argued that's exactly why Christ was crucified. There's a generation in the Judea of that era that simply didn't understand what he meant by righteousness. His wise counsels were often twisted and perverted. Before Abraham was, I am. They picked up stones. They're going to stone him. You being a man, make yourself God. The righteousness of the Son of God now having come in the flesh. Its necessity. It was fulfilling the whole Old Testament's prophetic core. The prophets longed for that. And by that he would bring salvation to the Gentiles. Was not understood by the people of, by the congregations who called themselves the congregations of the Lord throughout Judea, throughout Galilee, even beyond Jordan. It's ever been the case that God has to provoke his people, almost as with a firebrand, for them to come out of their lethargy and their comfort zone and face a great evil that the devil's brought upon them, or perish. When asked about a particular situation, they required that very situation. A decision had to be made. In fact, without a decision being made, there would be great destruction. Something had to be done, and yet the people that approached Martin Luther, what do? You see, their righteousness, their uprightness, their wisdom was not yet mature, nor sufficient for the day of calamity. Martin Luther advised them, he said, sin boldly. He didn't mean to go and sin. He meant that if you don't make a decision, you'll perish. And if you do make a decision as it stands right now, you're unable to discern whether or not it is a mature and right decision, but to do nothing guarantees loss to the kingdom of the devil. That's what John Adams was saying. And so Congress approved of the privateers. What were the privateers? Who were they? In September, we're going to be discussing and demonstrating the science of money. One of the reasons is for the very reason we're discussing now. Christians have a flank that's exposed. In fact, America has that flank exposed. It almost, in one sense, doesn't matter if we oppose evil, and yes, we should. But the outcome, as far as many of the enemies of righteousness in this kingdom, the outcome's assured because they have our economic flank. We're too exposed to the evils that are upon us economically. Maybe this lesson will begin to bring us hope. American privateering, in other words, a number of Americans that had ships, they re-outfitted them, they were smaller ships, faster ships, went out into the seas as privateers. And during the War for Independence, 1775, 1783, they were one of, and I'm quoting historians here, one of the most destructive economic aspects of the war against Great Britain. Thousands of privately owned American vessels preyed upon British commerce across the Atlantic, across the English Channel, the Caribbean, even the waters surrounding Britain itself. The privateers became the terror of coastal towns all throughout Great Britain and the British Isles. The privateers altered insurance rates, diverted Royal Navy resources, disrupted supply lines, influenced British politics, caused the fall of the British ministry, Lord North, increased the financial burden of the war to the tune of many billions of dollars in today's purchasing power. We're talking somewhere around 50 billion in modern day American dollars buying power. $50 billion of damage is what it would be the equivalent today. Now, American privateers captured or destroyed approximately about 1,700 British merchant vessels. Some say 1,500, others a little less than that, but most suggest at least 1,700, and there are British sources that suggest the number approached actually more like 2,000 vessels. These were not merely fishing boats that they seized, that they controlled. They weren't after rowboats and small schooners. They were attacking merchant ships. The captured ships included East Indiamen, the East Indies, the trade of the British East Indian companies. These are large merchant ships. And these schooners, these smaller ships, American privateers, would come upon them, but they were arrayed with cannon. They were experienced in war. The West Indies sugar ships, the coal ships needed to power, military transports, supply ships, tobacco vessels, merchantmen carrying manufactured goods to and from the British Isles. Every capture meant the loss of cargo, the loss of freight revenue, increased shipping delays, sometimes for months. In some cases, the losses of the goods and their markets wouldn't be recovered for years. Replacement costs became enormous. If you seize a cargo worth, in today's dollars, $1 million, its replacement cost to the British could be, well, at different times of the war, could be anywhere from $2 to $5 million, just replacing what was stolen. Higher insurance premiums, well, Lloyd's of London, right there in the heart of London, dramatically increased marine insurance premiums. Yes, the British merchant ships were insured. Before the war, about 5%, anywhere from 2 to 5%, depending on the cargo, depending upon the size of the ship and all that. During a time of heavy privateering, instead of 3% or 4 or 5%, Lloyd's of London was calling for insurance premiums of 20, 25% in a number of cases, or they simply wouldn't insure you. There were cargoes that went uninsured and went into the hands of the Americans, the British taking a complete loss. Now, these insurance premiums greatly increased the cost of the imports, the exports, consumer goods, military supplies. You can imagine British merchants petitioning the Parliament, complaining that the privateers were ruining Atlantic commerce. And this led to shortages in Britain. The privateers captured coffee, sugar, tar. Now, tar is needed for the ships. Tar was needed for insulating the ships against the water. Coffee, sugar, tar, hemp, timber to build ships, to build construction in the British Isles. Naval stores, all sorts of commodities needed for the Navy. Flour, rum, military supplies. Now, the British never starved. But had the war continued, yeah, they might have. In fact, that was part of the petitioning. Our people aren't starving now. So we want this war ended. Price increased throughout the war. Shortages were common. Naval costs, just the cost of the Navy alone. You see what's happening. Like one historian put it, yeah, the land battles in the War for Independence, they get all the press, they get all the write-ups. But it was the privateers that actually won America's independence. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "The New Englanders are fitting our light vessels of war, by which it is hoped we shall not only clear the seas and the bays hear of everything below the size of a ship of war, but they will visit the coasts of Europe and distress the British trade in every part of the world. The adventurous genius and intrepidity of those people is amazing. Now, there's several things you can take away from that statement. He, with great foresight, he saw that these privateers, especially out of New England, would cause the British fleet, well, the lighter ships would disappear, leaving only the big British ships, the warships that were, well, they were patrolling the Atlantic, our coastlines, trying to close up our bays, our cities, our ports. However, even he didn't fully foresee, as the statement shows, that the British warships would be withdrawn. That goes to the science of money. It's not that he's thinking, well, the privateers can't take on the big warships. They can take on the merchant ships. They can attack the smaller convoys, and the British warships can't catch them. What he wasn't thinking of was the indirect attack, the science of money. You see, the big British warships, there are about 300 warships the Royal Navy possessed. Hundreds had to be detached from their battle fleets to escort the merchant convoys, not just to and from, to feed the military, but to and from Canada, to and from the military, the armies that are in America, and they couldn't do that well. But the rest of the empire, instead of blockading America, though, or fighting off the French Navy, the ships had to guard commerce all throughout their empire. You see, the privateers were inflicting an increase in operating expenses. They didn't have to touch one of the British warships to defeat them. Now you have the science of money. By preying on the British coasts, raiding the coastal towns and harbors, the British warships are now called back to protect England, to protect shipping lanes, to protect the empire. And so the privateers don't have to fire one cannon shot. Truly, they wouldn't do so unless they defend themselves. But they're not going to do that against the big ships. And they didn't have to. Of course, if the British ships are withdrawing, and they did, from our bays, like the Chesapeake Bay, from our harbors, like Boston, see, they're patrolling right outside. They're waiting for our merchant ships to come out, and they'd hunt them down. But if they can't do that up and down the 13 colonial states' harbors, then that leaves more opportunity for a lot more Americans to convert their fishing ships, their fishing boats, and to build a lot more of them and go to sea. The British trade declined somewhere around 20%. That's due to captures, convoy delays. If you delay a convoy, time is money. The insurance rates that went up, oftentimes, convoys couldn't leave because they weren't insured. Disrupted routes, often. Merchant shipping had to go the long way around. The long way around the barn is the only sure way. Well, they have to go way around where the privateers were. Of course, the privateers caught on to that. The West Indies trade suffered particularly severe losses, devastating losses. That was one of the major economic strengths of Great Britain. Now, so far, all we're discussing here is the science of money and the reverberating effects of a destruction. The money science, if understood, does two things. It can destroy or can build. Now, within that range, there is defending oneself against its effects. So there's two things that are needed for us. We learn to defend against the ravages of those that are evil in the use of the money science, which most people can't see. That's why they need to be apprised of this and taught. There's to be a defense against it, exposure of it, but there's also building a future. See, Americans were also building a future with this. It wasn't just about disrupted British trade routes or the loss of cargo. First of all, the political consequences. The merchants became increasingly hostile against the continuation of the war, and they let Parliament know that. The port cities of London, Bristol, Liverpool, and Glasgow were very articulate and very powerful. Money talks, and the merchants in those ports were talking, petitioning, blasting Parliament. Many of them were arguing in pamphlets and articles, the war costs more than America's worth. And they're right. Estimates of the cost to Great Britain overall in today's buying power, today's purchasing power, is about $400 billion of loss. So they were right. And they weren't just talking about the privateers, although the privateers were the ones, of course, they're most conscious of. Merchant pressure was exceedingly severe on Parliament, pressuring for negotiations after Cornwallis was defeated at Yorktown. 1781, remember? We had discussed that. In fact, there's a great hurricane that disrupted the British fleets. And as a result, the French could come in and guard the port entrance, the final side of the blockade. The Americans had the other three sides, and Cornwallis had to surrender his army. That was the final blow, the major political blow, major blow in battle. The merchants caused the members of Parliament to argue. Why was the commerce unprotected? They had never faced this kind of warfare before. That's why. See, one thing about free market thinking, and Americans were oriented, as Edmund Burke pointed out. I'll use my terms to describe what he said. The Americans are constitutionally more savvy than all the rest of their English counterparts around the world because of their Protestant faith. Added to that, members of Parliament like Burke and William Pitt pointed out that we were economically savvy. You see, the Americans had learned what we now call free enterprise. Free enterprise doesn't stop working because you go to war. It creates a wisdom. And to outfit a fishing schooner and convert it into a fast-moving privateer, that takes some doing. It takes money. And so there were investors. You heard me right. There were those that were investing. Investors like William Bingham, John Livingston, the Cabots, the Lows, and the Peabodys of Massachusetts, the Darbys and the Browns of Rhode Island. They made vast fortunes during the war, and they did not hide that. Why were the convoy systems failing? Again, Britain had never faced a war like this. Why was the Royal Navy not able to stop American raiders? We would attack harbors. You know, when I was a kid, learning American history in a public school, which is all we had at that point, I learned John Paul Jones. He fought his famous battle at sea against the British. He had not yet begun to fight. Well, that's fine, but that heroism is not all that John Paul Jones was. John Paul Jones was the terror of the British Isles. Yes, he was part of what became the tiny Continental Navy and later on became the United States Navy, of course. But he gained his reputation, not from one battle. He gained it by being written up in British newspapers, pamphlets, debates in Parliament. He was constantly on the lips of the British people. He was inflicting economic damage to the harbors, the ships there. The harbor, he'd raid them. He'd plunder and set fire. He was the terror of the British Isles. That's the science of money. And I say, well, that's pretty easy to understand. It's warfare. You fire some cannon and you go into the harbor and wait a minute. That's not all I said. Yes, he did those things. But his calculations were like Sir Francis Drake that I've mentioned several times. Francis Drake, 200 years earlier, had so damaged the Spanish convoys bringing gold and silver from the New World back to Spain, getting ready to finance an invasion of England. He knew it. He knew that he could not possibly, he and the rest of the so-called sea dogs, could not possibly defeat all the Spanish galleons and capture all the... He couldn't do it. But what he did do is increase the cost of transport. The Spanish galleons, those large ships, were loaded with silver and gold. Well, the Spanish learned they had to surround those galleons with all kinds of warships, and that increased the cost astronomically. So much so that for all the silver and the gold, so much, by the way, that raised prices in all of Europe. That's how much there was. But the Spanish monarchy, pursuing its warfare against, for example, England later, sent an armada, and you probably heard the true story, that the people of England were thankful to God because the weather had sunk the armada. And the sea dogs, like Sir Francis Drake, picked on the rest of the stragglers in the huge armada of ships. But in doing that, Spain gradually became a third world power. Why? Had she not had all that cost inflicted on her, she could have easily recovered from the loss of the armada. He inflicted so much. He delayed the armada's attack, and when they did fail, they couldn't pursue a second. And that's exactly what the privateers did to England, to Britain. Britain had never faced a war like this. Lord North's government, the prime minister, his government collapsed in 1782. And Parliament had to look about for another prime minister that could lead them. And they were having problems finding leadership because their king, I call him the diaper king, George III, because he never learned how to. He needed diapers. Couldn't control himself. Petulant man who lost about 40% of his empire. Now, the British would get back much of that later. But because of him, he lost America, and they didn't get that back. They lost all of North America except Canada. They didn't get the American Maine, well, what became the United States of America. They lusted for Alaska, and they didn't get that. There are a number of islands, and so forth and so on. Effects on the Royal Navy. Parliament later on found that convoy duty, escorting the merchants, chasing privateers, coastal patrols, protecting Ireland, for example, part of the British Isles, protecting the English Channel, sending ships that away to protect merchants coming in and going out, reduce Britain's ability to concentrate naval power elsewhere, like in America. But I said that science of money can build. The Dutch and the Americans mastered that very issue. During war, let me repeat that. War is not all about destruction. The Dutch, in fighting the Spanish, who had invaded their land, began invasion, what was it, 1566 or so? In Alva, the Spanish general, murdered 18,000 Dutchmen, instituted a reign of terror, and yet his forces, the Spanish forces, ultimately were driven out of the Netherlands. But they continued on again, off again warfare with the Dutch. Meanwhile, while there's war going on, the Dutch churches are growing, Dutch merchandising, ships going to trade all around the world. The Dutch became the third largest, most powerful economy. And they did it through the science of money learned biblically, by the way, during war. 80 years of war. The 80 Years' War is what it's called. And they grew. And for a time, they were the third leading economic power. In fact, they withdrew. So lucrative was it, they withdrew from other foreign policy decisions that would have enmeshed them in wars, and they simply grew by trade. The Americans did the same thing. 1,700 American privateers received commissions from the Congress. 70,000 Americans served aboard the privateers. Captured cargoes were auctioned off. There were those that invested. I mentioned some of the names: the Cabots, the Lowes, the Peabodys, William Bingham, John Livingstone, the Darbys and the Browns of Rhode Island. They invested in order to receive back. And they received back manyfold what they invested. Their investments allowed the fishermen to convert their ships, their fishing boats, into privateers. And the profits would end up funding merchants, American merchants, shipbuilders. A whole industry grew. That which had been forbidden under the English in America, the American shipbuilding industry grew. American merchants, of course, sailed the seven seas, as they say. Sailors, lots of men went off to sea to become sailors, pursue careers. Investors, local economies thrived, like Boston. Prize money became a major incentive. Science would get a boost. Famous American privateers: Jonathan Harridan, out of Salem, Massachusetts. The same Salem, access to a port. He became America's perhaps most famous privateer. Now, the privateers, like John Paul Jones, actually is most famous probably out of all of our captains, but he technically isn't listed as a privateer. He is part of the Navy, the young Navy, but in essence, he did the same thing, pursued the same policies. Those that were not naval captains like he, Jonathan Harridan, out of Salem, Massachusetts, commanded the boat called the Pickering, very fast. Captured and defeated literally dozens of British vessels, many of them much larger than his work. John Manley captured numerous British supply vessels. His capture of the brig, the Nancy, in 1775 brought desperately needed military supplies to Washington's beleaguered Continental Army. Imagine that. Our forces needed and couldn't get the resources, but the privateers took it from the British, sent the cargoes back, and those cargoes were the provision for Washington's troops. Gustavus Cunningham, nicknamed the Dunkirk Pirate, because he operated out of Dunkirk, France. He raided British commerce in the Irish Sea, the English Channel. In fact, Gustavus Cunningham's ravaging shocked the British. He's specifically named in Parliament because he came so boldly, so close to home, as John Paul Jones would do. Luke Ryan operated also out of Dunkirk. He captured many British merchant vessels. It was his work in particular that forced Britain to beef up their coastal patrols. Again, we're back to Francis Drake. Coastal patrols cost money. Now they're going to beef up their coastal patrols because they're not getting the job done otherwise. That's a vast increase in expense. Luke Ryan's ravaging of the British cost the British enormous amounts of money. Silas Talbot conducted successful commercial raiding operations everywhere throughout the Atlantic. He would become one of the first captains in the U.S. Navy. Famous privateering actions, well, illustrative of the damage done, but the building that was being made. Remember where this cargo is going. Britain had stolen by their devastating science of money tactics, something we documented earlier. Now they're paying back, not willingly, America, just like in Egypt. When God's people had been plundered by the Egyptians through years of slavery, God sent the Egyptians to pay back and sent Israel out with much in the way of spoil. Captain John Mansley, his famous battle with the HMS Mellish, captured the British transport that was carrying thousands of muskets, powder, military clothing. The supplies went to Washington's armies. Harridan attacked the HMS Achilles in 1781. It was a many-hour battle. Harridan's Pickering fought a much larger British warship, the Achilles. He finally escaped being captured by the British, but the engagement became legendary among American seamen. Cunningham's Irish sea raids of 1777 repeatedly struck British commerce. Liverpool, Whitehaven, the Irish sea shipping lanes. Huge embarrassment to the British Admiralty. The privateer by the name of Jones and his attack on Whitehaven, 1778. Conducted, yes, with the help of the Continental Navy, rather than just as a privateer. The attack demonstrated Britain's own coastline was vulnerable. No matter how many coastal ships they put there to protect their cities, their bays, their rivers. His raid on Whitehaven caused widespread alarm. The economic damage, like I said, just from this alone, in their terms, about 3 million pounds sterling. In our buying power, you're talking many billions of dollars. That's not my statement. That's that of historians. So what's happening? There's a transfer of the wealth going back to America. Great Britain is being depleted. God's judgment is upon the English. So why was privateering so effective? Every captured merchant ship imposed costs that extended well beyond the value of the ship itself. They lost cargoes, they lost freight income. They, of course, lost typical opportunity costs. Insurers raised premiums across the Atlantic trade. And by the way, if as a merchant, your company took more loss than some other merchants, your premiums went up far, far more than other merchants. Many were wiped out. The Royal Navy diverted warships from offensive operations to becoming convoy escorts. The Francis Drake method of attacking a superior enemy. Investors became more cautious, slowing commercial activity. A lot of British investors simply were not going to continue investing in overseas merchandising. Parliament faced growing pressure from the merchants harmed by the war, and Britain's already large wartime debt continued to increase through direct and indirect costs. So, privateering became the most effective form of economic warfare, and though the write-ups go to the historians, go to the land battles, Yorktown, Lexington and Concord, Princeton, Monmouth, Brandywine Creek, those are all famous battles, no doubt. And though the writing goes, and easily 95%, the histories of the war pursue the land tactics and the battles and the outcome. But independence, as most historians now agree, was secured by the privateers. Economics is a far cleaner hit, more devastating than any of those land battles. Continental Army fought for independence on land. French Navy challenged Britain in Britain's fleet in the sea, but the privateers steadily attacked the commercial foundation of the British power, as one historian puts it. Attacked the commercial foundation of the British Empire. And the cumulative effect: higher rates, disrupted trade, diversion of resources, all of that helped weaken support for continuing the war until finally Parliament broke and negotiated the war into a peace settlement in 1783 at the Paris peace talks. What had happened? Great Britain's going to have to pay all those war debts. Meanwhile, America has had a shifting of wealth from Britain to America, and whole industries arose. Like John Adams said, it is prudent not to put virtue to too serious a test. We're not ready, we're not mature yet to handle the demands posed against us and the evils of the tyranny that we face. But they would learn. Righteousness would catch up rapidly. Yes, there are some things privateers did that weren't so great. By and large, the privateers were good men fighting for their country. It's a different kind of warfare. And it was all-out warfare. They secured independence, helped restructure and stimulate the American economy. And suddenly, the 13 ragtag colonies are now the awe of the world as the United States of America.
This has been Choke Points Through Time with Dr. Wayne Sedlak. Visit us at visionviewpoint.com, where you'll find a host of articles, books, and videos designed to answer any questions you may have. Join us Tuesdays and Fridays for Choke Points Through Time with Dr. Wayne Sedlak.